A millionaire CEO walked away from his newborn daughters until an accident left him alone in a hospital bed, and only they showed up. Ethan Thorne had always believed that control was everything. From the moment he built his first company at 24, he learned that the world rewarded the ruthless. He wore tailored suits, made decisions with precision, and eliminated anything that didn't serve his goals. Feelings were distractions. Family, complications. And so, on the day Isabella went into labor with their triplets, Ethan did not pace the hospital hallway or hold her hand to ease the pain. He stood outside the room, rigid and silent, unable to process what was happening. The sound of 3 newborns didn't fill him with awe, it filled him with panic. In the weeks leading up to the birth, he had grown increasingly distant, pulling away under the pressure of a future he hadn't wanted. He had once loved Isabella, or maybe he had just loved the version of her that existed before responsibility came knocking. Either way, the moment he saw her holding 3 tiny girls, her brown eyes wet with tears and her body trembling with exhaustion, he knew he couldn't do it. He couldn't be a father to 3. He couldn't be her partner. He couldn't give up the life he'd spent years building. He left the hospital the same day. There were no arguments, no grand scenes. He signed over parental rights, transferred a large sum of money to Isabella's account, and left without saying goodbye. His lawyers handled the rest. Over the years, he convinced himself he had done the right thing, that Isabella was better off without a half-man, that the money would cover what his presence couldn't, that the girls would never remember his face. He buried the past under mergers, stock options, and boardroom battles, rising higher and faster than any of his peers. In public, he was lauded as a genius. In private, he was alone. No one at the company knew he had children. Isabella's name never came up in interviews. Ethan kept no photos on his desk. He never talked about that chapter of his life, not even to the people closest to him. He built a fortress of routine, of precision, of cold, uninterrupted success. He convinced himself he had nothing to regret. But sometimes, when the city slept and the office lights flickered on empty floors, he'd catch his reflection in the window and wonder who he had become. He told himself that quietness was peace. He told himself that freedom was happiness. But an emptiness had grown inside him, too familiar to ignore, too deep to fill with any of the things he once thought mattered. And yet he didn't look back, not until fate forced him to. Not until the day everything stopped. The morning of the accident began like all others in Ethan's meticulously ordered life. He woke at 5, drank his black coffee in silence while he scanned market reports and answered emails before the sun had risen. His chauffeur was waiting downstairs at 6:30 on the dot, the car gleaming and warm inside, stocked with sparkling water and pristine documents in a leather binder. He had a board meeting at 9, followed by a lunch with investors and 2 media interviews scheduled for the afternoon. Every hour had been accounted for, every moment optimized. Ethan thrived on that structure. It kept the quietness manageable. It kept the thoughts away. But on that particular morning, a sense of unease lingered in the back of his mind. He couldn't explain it. His neck was tense, his thoughts were slower, and the sharp edge he normally relied on felt dull. He dismissed it as fatigue and got into the car anyway, already rehearsing the opening remarks for the meeting. The city traffic was the usual snarl of horns and impatience, but his chauffeur knew all the shortcuts. They were 20 minutes outside the city when it happened. The car took a detour off the main road, a scenic route Ethan had insisted on to avoid the morning jam. The road was quiet, lined with trees, and slick from the night's rain. At first, it was just a feeling, a sudden, unnatural slide of the tires, a lurch and balance too sharp to be a normal turn. Then, the brakes stopped responding. The chauffeur yelled, yanking the wheel, but the car didn't slow. It spun, fast and violent, the world outside blurring into streaks of green and gray. Ethan remembered the sound of metal bending. He remembered the violent shake, the shattering glass, the weightlessness before impact. And then everything went dark. When he woke, the world was white and sterile. The ceiling above him hummed with fluorescent light. There was a dull ache in his ribs, a sharper pain in his leg, and something heavy pressing against his chest. The air smelled of antiseptic and silence. A nurse leaned over him, startled when he moved. Her voice was calm, but rushed as she explained where he was, what had happened, and how lucky he was to have survived. It hadn't been an accident. The brakes had been tampered with. The police were investigating. Ethan heard the words, but they didn't register. All he could think about was the stillness, the way no one had come. Not a single voice he recognized. No friends, no colleagues, no family. He was alone, completely and painfully alone. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a fear that had nothing to do with markets or control. He had built a fortress so strong that not a single soul knew how to reach him when the walls came down. The silence that had once comforted him now felt like suffocation. And then the door opened. 3 small girls stood in the doorway, dressed in matching sweaters and holding hand-drawn cards. They looked at him with big, uncertain eyes. Light brown hair framed their faces, and their bright blue eyes, his eyes, locked onto him as if they were searching for something familiar. Behind them, Isabella walked into the room. Ethan didn't speak. He couldn't. He could barely breathe. Isabella's voice was calm, steady, and stronger than he remembered. "They asked to come," she said, her eyes not accusatory, just tired. "They wanted to meet their father." And so, the life Ethan thought he had buried came back in 3 pairs of small footsteps, and everything he thought he knew about himself was suddenly and devastatingly uncertain. The reunion. Ethan didn't know how long he stared at them. The 3 little girls standing just inside the hospital room, as if they weren't sure whether to approach or run away. Their presence hit him harder than the accident itself. For years, he had only imagined them in fleeting, guilty glimpses, blurry and abstract. He had no names, no voices, no memories of them beyond the day they were born. But now they were here, real and undeniable. 3 tiny versions of him and of Isabella, with her light brown hair, soft curls brushing her shoulders, and those piercing blue eyes that held the weight of too many unspoken questions. Isabella stood behind them, arms crossed over her chest, not in anger, but in quiet protection. She looked older than the last time he had seen her, but stronger too. Her gaze was direct and unwavering, but she wasn't here to scold or beg. Ethan saw it immediately. This wasn't a confrontation. This was a reckoning. The girls shuffled forward slowly, almost in unison, and one of them, he didn't know which yet, held out a small folded piece of paper to him. He reached out a trembling hand and took it. It was a drawing, messy and colorful. 4 stick figures stood under a yellow sun, 3 girls holding hands, and a man standing next to them, smiling. His chest tightened, a soreness building behind his ribs in a way no injury could explain. "They have always known about you," Isabella said after a moment. "I never lied to them, but I didn't give them false hope either. I told them their father made a choice a long time ago. And when they asked me what kind of man you were, I didn't have an answer I believed in anymore." Ethan looked down, the weight of shame almost too much to bear. He wanted to say something, to explain, but how could he? What words could fix the years he had thrown away? The birthdays he missed, the first steps, the nights Isabella stayed up alone while they cried. What right did he have to even ask for forgiveness? He looked back at the girls, who were now at his bedside, close enough to touch. They didn't seem scared. They seemed curious and hopeful, as if somewhere, deep in their young hearts, they were still open to the idea of him. "What are their names?" he asked, his voice raspy, barely audible. Isabella hesitated for a moment, then said softly, "Sophia, Liliana, and Amelia." He whispered the names back to himself, savoring them like something sacred. Each of them gave him a small, unsure but heartfelt smile, and he felt something crack open inside him that he hadn't even realized was there. "Why did you bring them?" he asked, still not daring to look at Isabella fully. "Because they wanted to come," she answered simply. "When I heard about the accident, I didn't know how I felt. Anger, sadness, maybe even guilt. But the girls, they didn't hesitate. They packed up their drawings and said, 'Maybe he's ready now.'" That one phrase shattered him. The simplicity of it. The truth of it. Maybe he was ready now. Not to be perfect. Not to erase the past. But to face it. To try. Ethan reached out slowly, uncertainly, and touched Sophia's hand. She looked at him, then held on. Liliana and Amelia followed, each placing their small hands on top of his. It was quiet, but everything in the world shifted in that moment. He looked up at Isabella and, for the first time in 5 years, said the words he should have said the day he left. "I'm sorry." Isabella didn't cry. She didn't soften immediately, but she nodded, just once. "You should be," she said, "but you're still their father. That hasn't changed." And with that, Ethan Thorne, once the most untouchable man in the room, realized that the smallest hands had found the cracks in his armor, and maybe, just maybe, they could teach him how to be human again. The new reality, the hospital stay, stretched longer than Ethan expected, and not just because of the broken ribs or the fracture in his leg. Time passed differently now. The days were no longer measured in stock updates or board meetings, but in the gentle patter of small feet entering his room each morning, in the rustle of construction paper as his daughters handed him new drawings, and in the uncertain but growing rhythm of being seen, truly seen, by 3 people he had once refused to know. The girls returned each day with Isabella, who kept her distance at first, always standing or sitting a little apart, watching with a calm he couldn't decipher. But the girls were brave in their kindness. They brought puzzles, read him books aloud, and asked him 1,000 questions that Ethan answered awkwardly but truthfully. They wanted to know what his favorite animal was, if he liked pancakes, and what his job was like before one of them told him he had been bombed by the tree. He learned to tell them apart by their voices and mannerisms. Sophia was the oldest by minutes, more serious and thoughtful, always observing him as if she were silently studying who he was. Amelia was the one who leaned into him without asking, more affectionate, always with a hand on his arm or shoulder. And Liliana was the firecracker, always asking the hardest questions, challenging his words with big eyes and a crinkled nose when something didn't make sense. They overwhelmed him, they disarmed him, and they reminded him, painfully, of everything he had missed. One afternoon, a police officer came to talk to him. The investigation had moved forward. It wasn't a mechanical failure. Someone had tampered with the brake line. His own business partner, a man he had once considered a friend, had tried to eliminate him from the equation for the sake of control. The betrayal was deep, but it didn't surprise him. What surprised him more was how little he cared about the company now. All he could think about was the fact that if he had died, he would have left nothing behind but silence and regret. No legacy, no love. Just an expensive tombstone. After the officer left, Ethan sat for a long time without speaking. Isabella, who had stayed in the room that day, finally asked, "Are you okay?" Her voice wasn't cold, but it wasn't soft either. It was the voice of someone who had learned to protect herself after too many disappointments. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the toll the last 5 years had taken. The lines around her eyes, the way her shoulders stayed tense, even when she was sitting. She was still beautiful, but it wasn't the same beauty he remembered. This was something stronger, earned, resilient. "I should have died," he said quietly, not as a plea for sympathy, but as a truth that had finally settled. Isabella didn't flinch. She just nodded. "But you didn't," she said. "So, what now?" He didn't have an answer yet, but he knew what he didn't want. He didn't want to leave that hospital and go back to an empty penthouse. He didn't want to live another day without hearing his daughters laugh or watching them argue over crayons. He didn't want to spend another second pretending that money could replace the sound of Sophia's careful questions, Amelia's humming, or Liliana's chaotic, unstoppable energy. That night, as he drifted off to sleep, Ethan dreamed of a house with worn-out wooden floors and voices yelling his name, not in fear or pain, but in joy. And for the first time in years, he didn't wake up alone in the dark. He woke to sunlight, to a soft murmur outside his door, and to the sound of 3 little girls arguing about who would give him their card first. It was chaos. It was imperfect. It was more real than anything he had ever known. The long road home. Ethan was discharged from the hospital 2 days later, wheeled out into the fresh morning air with a stiffness in his joints and a nervous ache in his chest that had nothing to do with broken bones. The hospital had offered to arrange transport to his penthouse, but he had already refused. He hadn't seen it since the accident, and he didn't want to return to its glass walls and empty silence. Instead, he looked up as a small, silver sedan pulled into the patient pickup area, and through the window, he saw Isabella at the wheel. The girls were in the back seat, pressed against the windows, waving anxiously the moment they saw him. His chest tightened again. He couldn't believe they had come. As he carefully settled into the passenger seat, Isabella didn't speak at first. The girls chattered non-stop behind them, debating what movie he should watch with them later and whether he liked macaroni and cheese. Ethan smiled to himself and answered when he could, still overwhelmed by the fact that they were speaking to him as if he had always been there. Isabella finally broke the silence between them once they pulled out of the hospital parking lot. She glanced at him and asked, "Where are we taking you?" She said it without sarcasm, but with the kind of straightforwardness that left no room for fantasy. He hesitated, then said, "Wherever you'll let me go." The words surprised even him, but they came from a deeper place than he had expected. Isabella looked at him for a long moment before looking back at the road. "We have a spare room. It's small, but it's clean," she said. "If the girls want you to stay, you can stay. On our terms." He nodded without hesitation. "Your terms are fine by me." And that was it. There were no emotional declarations, no dramatic scenes. Just a quiet agreement between 2 people trying to find common ground in a field of old mistakes. Isabella's house was modest but warm, filled with the signs of life. Drawings taped to the refrigerator, mismatched furniture, bookshelves overflowing with books and toys. It was the kind of home Ethan had never allowed himself to imagine. When he walked in, he felt clumsy and out of place, but the girls came running in ahead of him as if they had brought their favorite guest over for a sleepover. They showed him where he could put his things, gave him a pair of cartoon socks that they insisted he wear because real dads don't have cold feet, and debated who would get to sit next to him at dinner. He spent the first night in the guest room, which was barely big enough for the bed and a dresser, but it felt more honest than any hotel suite he had ever stayed in. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the creaks of the house, the hum of the old heater, and the muffled sound of giggling in the next room. It didn't feel like a second chance. It felt like a beginning he had never been brave enough to take before. The next morning, he woke to the smell of pancakes and the sound of Liliana arguing with Amelia about how many marshmallows were allowed in their hot chocolate. He made his way to the kitchen slowly, using the crutches he'd been given at discharge, and when he got there, the chaos stopped long enough for 3 little girls to smile and say, "Good morning, Daddy." Isabella handed him a mug of coffee without comment. He took it carefully, holding her gaze for a second longer than he intended. There was a flicker of something between them, not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. A truce, a shared promise to keep trying. As they sat down to breakfast together for the first time, Ethan found himself smiling without effort. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. And for a man who had once traded everything for the illusion of control, that truth felt like the most precious thing in the world. The long road to trust. Ethan settled into Isabella's house as if he were learning a new language, one that was spoken through routines, patience, and the quiet acceptance of a space that had once belonged to others. The first few days were awkward. He kept to himself when he wasn't with the girls, unsure of when to speak and when to step back. He offered to help with small things, unloading the dishwasher, folding laundry, doing his best not to disturb the delicate balance that already existed between the 4 of them. Isabella let him move through the house with caution, never cold, but always watchful. She was protective of her daughters, and rightfully so. Ethan had once walked away without a second thought, and that kind of abandonment left scars that weren't easily soothed by good intentions. But the girls never seemed to doubt him. They included him in everything, from picking out breakfast cereals to bedtime stories. They fought over who would get to sit on his lap while they watched cartoons, and snuck into his room with questions about his childhood or requests to braid his hair, even though he didn't have enough to braid. They made him laugh in a way he hadn't in years. They filled the corners of his silence with stories and sticky hugs, and the kind of fierce, unfiltered love that children give when they still believe in magic. One afternoon, while Isabella was out running errands, Ethan found himself alone with the girls in the living room. Sophia sat quietly coloring in a corner. Amelia played with plastic animals on the rug, and Liliana sat cross-legged in front of him, staring with the same intense gaze she had used the first day they met. "Why did you leave Mommy?" she asked, not angry, just curious. The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. Ethan hesitated. He wanted to lie, to soften the truth, but something in her honesty demanded his own. "Because I was scared," he said after a moment. "I thought I couldn't be a good dad, and I thought that being alone was better than doing it wrong." Liliana didn't reply right away. She picked at a thread in the couch cushion, then said, "But you came back anyway." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, I did." She gave him a small shrug. "Good. Now don't leave again." And just like that, the storm passed. Later that evening, after the girls were asleep, Ethan joined Isabella in the kitchen while she washed dishes. He dried them without being asked, the movement silent and companionable. When the last dish was put away, she leaned against the counter and looked at him, her expression softer than usual. "They love you," she said, "and I think they always will. But I need more than love for them. I need proof that you're not going to disappear when life gets hard again." He met her eyes and said, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not looking for the exit anymore." Isabella didn't smile, but she nodded. That was enough for now. As the weeks passed, Ethan began to reclaim parts of himself he hadn't realized were missing. He started to enjoy slow mornings with cereal and cartoons. He began to look forward to reading books aloud at night, with 3 heads resting on his shoulders. He fixed the back fence, mended the squeaky cabinet door, and learned to braid 3 identical pigtails with shaky fingers and the girls' endless instructions. He started making pancakes on Sundays and learned to pack school lunches with handwritten notes. His leg was healing, but what changed more was the way he moved. He no longer walked with the weight of performance or pressure. He moved with presence, with the intention of staying. He asked about Isabella. He asked her how her day had been. He offered support when she looked tired. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt. But slowly, the foundation between them began to shift from cautious to steady. One night, when Ethan was putting the girls to bed, they asked if he could stay with them until they fell asleep. He lay down in between them, listening to their slow breaths, feeling their small hands wrapped around his arms. It was the safest he had ever felt in his life. And as he closed his eyes, Ethan finally understood that fatherhood wasn't about never failing. It was about showing up anyway, over and over, until the people you love believe you always will. A new beginning. Autumn came slowly, painting the trees outside Isabella's house in rich oranges and reds, and with it came a quiet sense of change that wasn't just in the weather. Ethan had been living with them for weeks now, and while there were still moments of awkwardness, moments where the old distance tried to creep back in, they were fewer and further between. The mornings had become predictable in the most comforting way. The girls would wake him with whispers and giggles, climbing into his bed to tell him about their dreams, or demand pancakes before he had even opened his eyes. Isabella would already be in the kitchen, coffee brewing, her hair pulled back in that same effortless bun she had worn since their early days, when things were simpler yet more fragile. They had built a routine that held together, not out of obligation, but out of choice. Ethan had slowly started to help more with school pickups and drop-offs. He volunteered for classroom craft time, even if he had no idea how to use a glue gun. He read bedtime stories in silly voices, packed lunchboxes with heart-shaped notes that the girls proudly showed to their friends, and learned the rhythm of family life not from a manual, but by watching, listening, and trying. One night, while helping Amelia with her spelling homework, he looked up and saw Isabella watching him from the hallway. Her eyes were no longer wary. They weren't completely open either, but the skepticism that had once lingered in her gaze had softened into something closer to acceptance. They met in the kitchen later, after the girls had gone to bed, and she poured them both a glass of wine. There was no ceremony, no underlying tension, just 2 people sitting at the kitchen table, with the sound of a quiet house all around them. "I never thought you'd come back," she said after a long silence. "And if I'm honest, I never thought I'd want you to." "I didn't think I deserved it," Ethan replied, and for once, there was no defense in his voice. "Maybe I still don't. But I'm not here to fix everything with words. I'm just trying to be here, to show them, and you, that I won't leave again." Isabella looked at him, her eyes tired but honest. "You hurt me," she said plainly, "and you missed so much. But what you're doing now, it matters. They trust you, and part of me wants to trust you too. I just don't know how to let go of all the years I carried it alone." Ethan nodded. He didn't expect forgiveness in one night. He had stopped expecting a quick redemption. "Then let me help you carry it now," he said quietly. "Not by replacing what's been lost, just by showing up for what's still to come. They didn't talk much more that night. Instead, they sat in the soft yellow light of the kitchen, side by side, sipping wine and letting the silence settle comfortably between them. It was the kind of silence that doesn't demand anything, the kind that lets two people simply breathe. The next weekend, the town held its annual harvest fair, and the girls had begged Ethan to go with them. Isabella had planned to take them alone, but when Liliana announced that Daddy should wear the pumpkin shirt too, he found himself in an oversized orange hoodie with a smiling jack-o'-lantern on the front, matching his 3 daughters. At the fair, strangers smiled at them as they passed, assuming they were just another happy family. And for the first time, Ethan didn't feel like he was pretending. He held their hands, bought too much cotton candy, purposefully lost a ring toss game, and watched Isabella laugh without reservation when he was roped into a pie-eating contest with a bunch of local dads. It was messy, loud, and chaotic, but it felt right. It felt like something real. That night, after they got back home and the girls were asleep, Ethan went outside and stood on the porch under a sky full of stars. Isabella joined him without a word, sliding a blanket around his shoulders. They stood there together, not as strangers who once shared a past, but as two people who were finally starting to build something that would last. "I never thought peace could look like this," Ethan murmured. Isabella leaned against the railing and replied, "That's because you used to think peace meant control. But this," she gestured toward the house, toward the laughter that still faintly echoed inside. "This is something you let happen, not something you forced." And for the first time in his life, Ethan understood the difference. The first snow of winter arrived silently on a December morning, blanketing the neighborhood in white and hushing everything into a soft silence. Ethan was the first one up, sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming mug of coffee between his hands, and the windows lightly fogged over from the warmth inside. The world outside looked untouched, motionless, as if it had paused for a moment just to let something new begin. He had never cared much for winter before. He had never realized how peaceful the snow could make everything feel. But now, watching the flakes fall in silence, he felt something stir inside him, a quiet sense of gratitude that was no longer tied to what he had built, but to what he was learning to be a part of. That morning, the girls came bounding downstairs in matching pajamas, their excitement erupting into squeals the moment they saw the snow. Ethan helped them into their coats and boots, laughing as they stumbled over each other, trying to get outside. Isabella stood in the doorway, coffee in hand, wrapped in an old sweater, her eyes tired, but filled with a quiet joy as she watched her daughters run out into the snow-covered yard. Ethan turned to her and smiled, and she didn't look away. She smiled back, slow and real, the kind of smile that doesn't come easily unless it's earned. More importantly, that afternoon, they decorated the house for the holidays. The girls hung glitter-covered ornaments on a slightly crooked tree Ethan had helped them pick out the day before, and he found himself stringing lights in the living room, with Liliana perched on his shoulders, yelling instructions like a tiny general. Isabella put on Christmas songs on the old stereo, singing softly as she helped Amelia untangle a garland that had gotten into a hopeless mess. Sophia, the quietest one, carefully labeled their handmade stockings, using glitter pens and tape, making sure everyone's name was perfectly spelled out, including Ethan's. As the evening settled and the snow continued, they all gathered on the couch with hot chocolate and a pile of blankets. The fire crackled softly, and the girls curled into him, as if they had always belonged there. He read them a story, his voice firm but full of wonder, and when they had fallen asleep one by one, he didn't move. He just sat there, his arms full of a warmth and trust he still didn't believe he deserved, but would never stop trying to protect. Isabella joined him after a while, sitting down beside him with a quiet sigh. They didn't speak for a few minutes, both of them watching the snow swirl outside the window, feeling the rhythm of a home that no longer needed to be healed. It had healed, slowly and imperfectly, but complete enough to breathe again. Finally, she reached for his hand and laced her fingers through his. Her touch was no longer wary. It was certain. "I wasn't sure we'd ever find our way to this," she said quietly. "I didn't even know this was possible," he admitted. "You changed," she said, "and not because you had to, because you wanted to. I didn't want to lose them. Or you." "Not again." "You didn't," she said. "You came back." He nodded, swallowing the emotion that was rising in his throat. "This, all of this, it's the only thing that's ever felt real." Outside, the wind howled softly through the trees, but inside the house, there was only peace. Ethan knew the road ahead wouldn't be free of mistakes or hard days, but he also knew he wouldn't leave again. He was no longer a man who ran from fear or buried himself in success to avoid love. He was a father, a partner, and for the first time in his life, he was home. In the flickering light of the fire, surrounded by sleeping children, and the quiet heartbeat of the woman who had never stopped being the center of everything he truly needed, Ethan Thorne finally understood what it meant to stay.